Colette Brooks. I'm the faculty advisor to this dynamite group of presenters who are part of the Dean's Honor Symposium, which is something we do every year, and it's becoming more and more important as we get up into further iterations of it. This group, Julia Foote, Miriam Powell, and Dominique Flaksberg, did not know one another until January when we started to meet. So just think about that. They have so much in common, but they didn't know it. This is a way of getting students together. We would like to thank a special group of students. For the first time, first-year students attended some of our rehearsals and gave us really valuable feedback along with the faculty advisor. It's a wonderful way the first-year student can kind of imagine themselves in these seats in a couple of years. All right. I'm just going to talk louder. The first-year students are Stella Moranos, Alyssa Salas, Madison Krebs, and Annie King, along with their faculty advisor, Megan Milks. And if they're in the room, I'd like them to stand. Big shout out to you. All right, without further ado,
I am above it all and at the bottom of the sea.
Sprawling, centerless, between locations, but of none of them.
I am cool, sleek, invisible, untouchable.
Fluid, flowing, and transformative. I am present in all motion, transformations, and cycles of the earth.
I am completely enclosed, yet I am always open. Bits of information circulating constantly.
I am hearth and home, the family dog and the automobile.
I am the beginning and the end of all that lives.
Warehouses of metal boxes, wires, and cables.
Conformist and repressive, I am full of boring people and boring houses.
Misplaced and displaced, but never interrupted from my course.
I am a broad network of distributed power, concentrated in singular, remote sites.
I have been hidden under pavement and cursed as flood, burdening traffic in the rain.
Dangerous, haunted, my empty streets and tract homes invite the potential for evil.
Highly centralized and essentially dematerialized, networked, repetitive, and technical.
But I persist, as a blessing to the earth and as an unseen curse for those that build barriers to navigate in the pavements above me.
I am the perfect lawn, the happy family.
I am the data center, I am the cloud. I am a material reality of a digital world.
I am the suburban home. I am the American dream.
I am the rivers hidden under your feet. Do you know where you are? Welcome to Hidden Topographies of Everyday Life. And we got some zines that are on the chair, so if people can look through, we have a little bit more information if you feel like you're getting lost or want to learn a little bit more of what we are talking about, you can always go through the zine. So my name is Dominique Flaksberg. I am a dual degree in global studies and fashion design. And I actually started this project when I went abroad to Bhutan a couple semesters ago. And I was looking around and was really impressed by all the mountains that I saw. And people around me asked, well, aren't you from Sao Paulo in Brazil? Aren't there a lot of mountains there? And then I realized I knew nothing about the city where I grew up in. And that made me start researching what was the environment that I lived in, why did I grow up in this big city and didn't know it was surrounded by rivers and mountains. So my research started like that. And by researching the hidden rivers in the environment around me, I navigated this project and started to look at political and social implications of this urban constructions and urban movements in cities, which brought me to collaborate in this presentation with my two friends that are going to introduce themselves.
So hi, I'm Julia Foote, and for my senior thesis project, I'm looking at horror film and using it as a way to look at suburban culture in the US, which has been a lot of fun. And I've been spending a lot of time with the suburbs in reality, on film, and in our shared cultural imaginaries. And one thing I've noticed through doing that is that, actually, my cards are out of order. Through doing that, I've become particularly interested in the pursuit of the American dream on film. So what it looks like to be a good suburban family, as well as what it looks like to fail at being a good suburban family. And it turns out that the pursuit of that and the pursuit of the American dream, especially on film, involves a lot of hiding some things while making other things hypervisible. And that element of hiding and making hypervisible is the part of my thesis that I'm sharing with you guys today.
Wonderful. Hi, I'm Miriam Powell. This is my 3rd year at the New School, and while in my time here, I've had the tremendous privilege of being able to explore a variety of interests and inspirations across a wide array of disciplines and media. And one of those, kind of at a very broad level, is understanding how particular politics and relations of power may be inscribed onto the surface of the earth through the development of material infrastructure. The piece of infrastructure that is of interest to my project that I'm presenting today is that of the data center, which, like the sites that my co-panelists and I have all focused on, may broadly be understood as hidden. So just to make the conversation as inclusive as possible, I want to give my very untechnical and unsophisticated understanding of what exactly a data center is, which is basically that despite kind of the immaterial rhetoric that often surrounds the internet, for all of this data to remain in circulation, like very material electrical firings have to take place somewhere. And the data center is, like effectively a warehouse storing servers where these electrical firings take place. And I think the first way in which the data center is hidden is just in its very nature, in that it's often a very isolated site. So these are very far away from where we typically work on our laptops, rather often in ambiguous locations that are hard to identify. And when I first became interested in the data center, I decided it would be really exciting to be able to kind of pursue this research in person. So I sent a handful of emails out to all of the Google data center locations in Anglophone countries and asked if I might be able to come and conduct some of my research. And I received a lot of very polite declines, which kind of reminded me that while our data flows freely, our bodies are restricted from entry. And the language, sorry, wrong way. The language of these emails particularly struck me, especially with this phrase, the industrial nature and security of operations, which for me is kind of puts forward a kind of strange dissonance between the nature of these sites, or what the nature of these sites is claimed to be, and how these sites are represented even by the companies that facilitate the operations of these sites themselves, of particular interest here, like those of Google. So what interests me in particular about how Google represents its data centers is the kind of almost submission of the data center to its natural surroundings. When you first go on Google's data center website, you're met with this very curious phrase, where the internet lives. And yet you are constantly given these photos that kind of don't focus on the data centers too much, but often present a landscape, a beautiful, expansive blue sky that looms over this piece of built environment. So for me, that kind of begs the question, where does the internet live? And what exactly do they mean by live? And so understanding that kind of fundamental dissonance in representation, I'm also inclined to think about what I am inclined to consider misrepresentation in the kind of broader rhetoric surrounding internet infrastructure, which is the cloud, and how this constant invocation of the immaterial and ethereal serves as another layer of occlusion of the absolute and physical. And even something as benign as a Google billboard, for me, serves to kind of further occlude the material realities of production, maintenance, and usage of these technologies. kind of becoming like a third layer of hiddenness on top of this infrastructure, which is the data center.
So when I started thinking of hiddenness in my project, I was looking at the rivers. And a little bit of background, I was looking at Brazil, and most specifically Sao Paulo, which is the blue dot in the first map on your left. And most specifically than that, in the center of Sao Paulo, which is where I'm from. And as you can see, there are a lot of rivers in the city, but as I mentioned earlier, I didn't know they exist. And the first step on my project was understanding why. So when my grandparents were kids and lived in Sao Paulo, this is the kind of rivers they had access to. So they could swim in it. There were like sports clubs around it. And it was somewhat clean for leisure activities. But through the process of urbanization of Sao Paulo, a lot of the original rivers got channelized and became basically bases for big roads. So as you can see in this slide, the blue lines would represent how the river used to look like, and it essentially lost its natural curves and became this very efficient space for a road in which the city could function. So in the process of urbanization, the natural state of the rivers was the first thing that got lost. The second thing that got lost is its waters and how the waters navigated, because a lot of trash gets thrown into the rivers, and then an environment in which you could swim and have recreational activities became this thing that had a really heavy negative meaning to it, which was of rivers being polluted and dirty and not smelling really well. So that's a picture of how the rivers could look like today when they're being cleaned. And they've been trying to clean it for a long time, and of course we don't have the resources for it because we keep polluting them on top of that.
All right, so I'm looking at hidden spaces in the suburbs. Suburbs are very old things, both as concept and in practice, but for my project, I'm specifically looking at the suburbs that came up in the US post-World War II, because I think those have a very special importance in the cultural imaginary of the US, and they're the ones that you most often see on film, and I'm looking at horror films. So suburbs after World War II grew in part because there was a housing shortage in the US after World War II. One of the remedies to this housing shortage was government funding, both for the construction of suburbs and for loans for people to buy suburban houses. As part of this funding, though, the government was pretty conservative in what types of suburbs they wanted to allow to be built, because they wanted them to keep their value for a long time. So the government only funded suburban homes that were of particular architectural styles. The ranch house was particularly popular. And they also were only giving loans to, or mostly giving loans to, young white families. So you had the emergence of this very specific suburban environment across the US, where you had a specific topography of the suburbs, and you also had very specific demographics for the suburbs. And with the emergence of this topography, you also had a specific set of discourses around the suburban home and family that you saw emerge. Many of these were actually carried through from the Victorian era. So since the Victorian era in the suburbs, you had the idea that the home was a woman's sphere, and she was supposed to keep the home and raise the children and instill good morals in the children. And the home was supposed to be able to reflect this job of the wife, of the mother. The home was supposed to be an architectural expression of family togetherness in many ways. One way we see this during post-World War II suburbs was in the growth of the family room, which didn't really exist as a room before then. The family room was in the center of the house, and it was mostly for children to play in, though it was also multi-use. Mothers were supposed to be able to see into it from the kitchen, because you also had a growing interest in open-plan housing at the time. And the neighbors were going to be able to see both the mom and the children, because you also had the growing popularity of picture windows. So everything was visible, and specifically what was visible was a good family and a well-structured family. And this is the beginning of the hyper-visibility of certain spaces, which were also meant to make visible the well-structured family. But in the face of this, right, you also see the request for more private spaces. So you have interviews with suburban moms from the time saying there's not enough private space in the home, I have nowhere to go to be alone. The family, especially the suburban family, can't always be the well-structured, morally good family that it is meant to be. And this imperfect family needs its own space as well. For parents, this could be the bedroom, but not always, and that's only one room of the house. And so you have this very specific dynamic emerging in suburban space, where the good family is in the hyper-visible spaces of the house, and anything that must be hidden is put in the private spaces, which is something that we also see in suburban horror, interestingly. So how does hiddenness function? We've taken you through different hidden spaces, from the global scale to the scale of the city to the scale of the neighborhood and the home. But our next question is, what does that hiddenness do? When it is in practice, what is it achieving, and what does it look like? So for my suburb stuff, I'm turning to film to get into the role hidden places play in the suburbs. I find that horror movies are a great way to read cultural narratives because they give a place to our fears. They make concrete things that might only be abstract in their terror, and they give us kind of a playground for these horrible things to play out on. Horror movies in particular also love suburban spaces, love hidden spaces. They love suburban spaces too. But so my question was, what are they doing with these hidden spaces? It's a really common trope in suburban horror to have things in the walls, or hidden attics, or things in the basement. And so what's happening there? To answer this, I want to turn to a movie I'm really fond of, which is Paranormal Activity. It's set in a suburb somewhere in California. It's vague. A young couple lives there called Micah and Katie, and they're trying to build a happy suburban life, but they're being haunted by this demon, unfortunately for them. Paranormal Activity is also super useful because it all takes place inside the home. There's one establishing shot of their suburban neighborhood, and for the rest of the movie, it's all found footage style, just inside their house. So you really get into the home and the family and the way they interact. The pivotal space for Paranormal Activity is the bedroom. This is where most of the haunting of Micah and Katie happens. And it also represents everything we know about them as a couple, as our protagonists, that they're young, they're happy, they're suburban. That's them. So Micah maybe likes his camera a little too much, they like their objects and their technology too much, but they're a couple that we're rooting for. As the movie progresses, their relationship deteriorates. And in tandem, we also start to see new parts of the house emerge. So in a scene I particularly love, one night the demon wakes them up in the middle of the night, and they go down the hallway to their hall closet and they find an attic in their house that they didn't know was there. So that's the attic. Micah goes up into the attic and it's super creepy, but there's nothing there except for a photo of Katie as a child. And Katie says, "That's impossible, that shouldn't exist. My house burned down as a child, we lost everything." And this is how it is revealed to us, the audience, and to Micah, that Katie has actually been haunted by this demon since she was a child, and it burned down her house, and she never told him. So she's been keeping this big secret from him. And what I find particularly interesting is that her secret is physically hidden in the home. It's been hiding alongside something horrific in the attic, which is something we see throughout suburban horror. Hidden spaces hold secrets about someone's past, about the house's past, or about an element of the family dynamic that ultimately destroys the family, which ties into what we were saying about the suburbs before, about hidden spaces being the spaces of failure. So, yeah.
All right, as Julia has wonderfully laid out for us, hiddenness not only is often a formal characteristic, but serves some kind of a function. When viewed in isolation, the hiddenness of the data center may be easily disregarded. And I'm not so much interested in where each data center is, but rather how they connect to each other despite their apparent hiddenness and isolation. After all, it's not solely data centers that are internet infrastructure, but also countless miles of fiber optic cables spanning under our feet and over ocean floors. So towards the end of envisioning that network, I want to kind of shift gears to where this project actually all started for me with Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome, particular its application in the US Pavilion at Montreal Expo 67. So in his book Last Futures, Douglas Murphy describes how entering this dome, it kind of seems to dissolve into its natural surrounding. And for me, this description immediately conjured images of the crisis of enclosures that Deleuze describes in his postscript on societies of control. But for me, the geodesic dome isn't interesting only as a visual metaphor for the relations of power characteristic of the society of control, but also as a hypothetical diagram of the networks of cables that span our globe and the many points that they connect. So for me, it's important when discussing the dome to recognize the military applications that it was ultimately put to use, if only to raise the question of how seemingly utopian technologies might be put to more insidious projects. Towards that end, I think it's useful to observe that the distance between data centers and the populations they connect are not as equal nor as short as the distances of metal bars that comprise the geodesic dome. Indeed, I'm inclined to think that as part of the work of globalization that takes place elsewhere in the data center, the site ultimately is complicit in the lubrication of global flows of capital and thus the deepening of global inequalities. After all, the data center would be useless if not for its connections to sites like the global city.
So Miriam and Julia talked about how Hiddenness function in their projects, and I think a really interesting point that they both mentioned is that Hiddenness has a point of failure, right? Like whenever there's a hidden space or a space that you can access, there's something implied in there that we don't understand. And by understanding that this hiddenness exists, we can get to understand something. In the case of the rivers of Sao Paulo, the same happens. By understanding that the rivers exist in that space and they are hidden, you get to realize all the implications of the urbanization of the city and all the failures that came with that. So in this slide, you can see a picture of how Sao Paulo got constructed and colonized by Portugal. It got, the people that lived in the city in the process of urbanization had a really Eurocentric mindset and believed that a city should look like an European city, right? It's pretty, it's beautiful, it's civilized, it's developed. So the model in which the city was developed was not really focused on the rivers, which is the mode of transportation that, for example, indigenous people that were there before colonial dispossession occurred. So instead of following the rivers for transportation and to use for water or to grow food around, they decided to follow centric model that went from a center of the city and spread around, which was what Europe was doing, which brought us to a city that caused a lot of, that looked like this. So roads would go through the water and around it rather than the water being used for transportation, which would have been a more sustainable if you think in current vocabulary to describe. So this is how the city looks like. And you can see this one river in the city, and we actually have two main rivers that are visible, but all the smaller ones are not. So although I knew about the existence of two of the rivers, where are all the small ones? Why aren't we seeing them? And how do we happen to see them? So again, you can see in a very short amount of time, 2 generations, a river that went from a leisure space, even though it was already modified from its natural shape, became this polluted, very unpleasant space that people would just encounter when they were in traffic going back home or going to the airport or just walking through. But these roads that got built around the rivers and over the rivers, and the city model that completely ignored the natural environment around, causes a lot of problems in the city, which are visible today, one of which is social inequality. Because you build the roads and you build the center of the city and you have most of the jobs there, but a lot of people can't afford it. So the roads are built so people can access it. And well, that brings a lot of traffic as well because there's a lot of lack of planning. This is a very well-known picture that shows the barrier between a favela on the left and a very expensive building, which is just one of the examples of how this lack of infrastructural planning, considering the environment, can cause people to live in different situations, which also bring us to reflect why do we have to have a center of a city and not a city that revolves around its waters and has other kinds of structures. But so how does this hiddenness of the rivers become visible then, if the rivers are there and like this whole infrastructure has been built, but most people don't know about it? This is an artist installation by Eduardo Starr, and you can see more of it in the zine. But he basically installed these kayaks with mannequins in the middle of the trash in the water, signaling attention to, as I mentioned before, a leisure space that was now unused and couldn't be used. A lot of urbanists, activists, artists, and people working in education have been reflecting about these rivers and why are they misused and how can we change that. The picture on the left and the picture on the right were taken around 30 years apart, but both show floods. Floods are the main way in which the rivers are noticed in Sao Paulo, but the language used around it is really interesting. People say, wow, our tunnels and our streets got flooded by the water. But the water was there even before the city was built. So a lot of these activists are reflecting on ways we can change our vocabulary about the water. So instead of saying the river is polluted or the river made traffic worse, it's, well, the traffic is worse because the planning of these roads was not in the place that was convenient for when floods happen, because floods are always going to be there. They're part of nature. And as humans, we often fail to acknowledge what came before our existence or what came before our existence as it is. So another example would be in colonial history and how like indigenous people in the area were using the rivers and working in accordance to them rather than ignoring them and then blaming them in the future. This is one of my favorite pictures of the projects I've been researching. It's this activist movement called Rios e Ruas, Rivers and Roads. And what they do is a lot of geographical and activist work to bring communities to understand where the rivers were. So for this one, they got people to walk around the city carrying this huge blue fabric to show where the rivers would have been if they were existing there. And that makes people understand your environment better, want to care about it, and even start thinking of ways in which they can bring this water back and pollute it less and get in contact with the few parts of the city where you still get a little bit of river in. So those are some other pictures that show some of the projects. The drawing that you can see on the upper part is this amazing illustrator that reimagined the city and how it would be leisure-wise and if we had the river. So this is a tunnel that right now it's covered, but what if it had a swimming pool? Her name is Angela Leon. And as I mentioned before, education, pollution, and other kinds of activism, which are amazing ways to build community and help people realize the existence of the rivers even before we got colonial indigenous dispossession and colonial presence.
So making things visible. In many ways, horror is what makes the hidden spaces in the suburban home visible. And at the end of my last section, I was talking about how horror does this, and I said that suburban horror really kind of shows us these hidden spaces and this dark side of the suburbs that we don't see in other places. But one thing I want to pull out about that is how much suburban horror leans into that fact and leans into the edginess factor and the coolness factor it gets from saying, we're the only place where you can see the American dream be destroyed and like the suburban family fall apart. And we're like showing you how these things don't work. But if you look at the structure of a lot of suburban horror films, something more interesting is going on, which is that these films aren't critiquing what they say they're critiquing. In suburban horror, families often seem like they're being punished. They're going through these horrible trials and they spend the whole movie dealing with it. But what I've noticed is that they're often not punished for trying to achieve the suburban American dream. They're punished for doing so incorrectly. So to go back to Paranormal Activity, Micah and Katie are a nice couple. They're a little boring as protagonists, but we're supposed to like them. We're supposed to want them to be able to live their happy life in California and to not get eaten by a demon. And the movie really isn't challenging our desire for things to go well for them. It doesn't want us to not want them to be happy. And it's also not challenging the idea that going well for them, having things go well, means them living a good suburban life and being able to fulfill that dream. Instead, the movie shows us the ways in which they fail at achieving that dream. They keep secrets. Micah likes using his camera too much, and it's actually a whole plot point that the demon gets riled up by the camera, but Micah won't stop using it. And so in this way, we as audience members are not supposed to take away from the movie that the suburban dream isn't worth it. We're supposed to take away that these are the ways that which you mess up in trying to achieve that dream, and we shouldn't do that. Which ties into something broader I'd like to point out, which is that the US, broadly, culturally, loves to critique its suburbs. The first suburban development of the type I'm talking about was built in the late 40s, and already by 1955 we had The Organization Man come out, which was one of the first books to critique the suburbs and to say everyone's the same there and it's really boring and it's a terrible environment. And I think a lot of the critiques of the suburbs are really valid and should be made, and that we should be critical about the suburbs in the US. But I also think that only focusing on the critiques is a little hypocritical, because if we also look at the US broadly, culturally, we love our suburban environments and we're really attached to them and to the idea of the perfect family and the American dream that can be achieved there. And it's important to acknowledge this duality. Even in horror movies, which claim to show us the destruction of the American dream, in most cases, they're actually reinforcing the importance of chasing that dream. All of which ties more broadly into, narratives we tell ourselves about where we live and why we live there and what we want out of those spaces, which I think is present in all of our topics. It's how we figure out the world we live in.
So speaking about love and attachment, I think it's useful to point out that when internet infrastructure functions correctly, we're not inclined to be aware of its existence. Like, when my Wi-Fi is perfect, I don't think about where it comes from. It's only when a certain failure happens, as we've seen with Rivers and with Suburban Horror, that these infrastructures are called to our attention. It's only when a power line is knocked out by a storm that I'm inclined to think about the broad networks that my apartment is connected to. So, in as much as the failure, I think, is an active site where hiddenness may become visible, by the very nature of the fact that it is meant not to happen, it's not very useful for kind of a more perpetual revelation of these hidden spaces. Towards that end, I'm often interested in thinking about the data center in terms of heat. The fact that these sites are sites of electricity, sites that emit energy. So maybe this poor shark biting a fiber optic cable on the bottom of the ocean floor kind of sensed that electricity and is more aware of the functioning of these internet infrastructures than even I am sitting on my laptop in my apartment. Still yet, for the most part, we're left wandering in the cloud, often inclined not to make connections between it and the infrastructure upon which it depends. And again, I think as Dominique demonstrated with the Rivers, like this project has shown to me that it's largely an active effort of investigation and reminder that makes these hidden spaces more visible. So I think for me, this project is kind of about calling attention to these sites and their application in daily life, learning to see what isn't visible. And I think it can be an incredibly broad project, even of just reminding ourselves of conditions like these when we operate in conditions like these. So with that, I think we'd like to kind of open it up to broader comments and questions from the audience. But first, I'll kind of take a crack at this question we all find ourselves landing on perennially of, like, well then, what do we do? Which for me implies a set of other questions. Namely, do we need to do anything? And firstly, does hiddenness need to be made visible? And obviously these are questions that are very difficult to answer, but for me, they bear some thought, especially as Greenpeace has reported in 2017 that the IT sector alone consumes 7% of global electricity. Considering the fact that the internet accessing public is a relatively small minority of the global population, it's important to think about these imbalances and what we might understand ourselves as wanting to do about them. I think towards that end, we've all brought up access kind of implicitly in our projects, as even the idea of hiddenness itself implies a certain exclusion.
Yeah, and also the idea of hiddenness, and I mean, one of the questions we asked ourselves a lot throughout the project was, if it becomes visible, if we show hiddenness, what do we do with that, in the sense of, can we do something about the places where we live? Do we know where we are? Can we get to know where we are? Can we reflect upon the spaces we are and change that, so the hiddenness can maybe become visible in a way that doesn't show a failure but a solution? And that's something that could also, that was also a point of reflection and discussion in our projects.
Yeah. So if you guys have questions or comments, yeah.
So I think for both of your topics, it's very clear that it's something that has been brought by society, or it's come from old ages, the fact of the river that you can see, or it's embedded in society. But your topic is very new, so it should have been planned, organized, and understood. Did you look into this piece on your hidden? Because this is uncontrollable. I don't know if uncontrollable is the correct word, but it's been there for many years. But data centers is kind of newer compared to those two.
Well, I think perhaps interestingly, as new as the data center might seem, it largely depends on infrastructures that have been in place for over 100 years now. The first cables that were laid under the ocean are still largely in use, and even new fiber optic cables that are laid today largely follow the same patterns. In a wonderful book, The Prehistory of the Cloud, it's laid out that often data centers occupy sites that actually were former infrastructures, like warehouses, even military sites that have been put to many other applications. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that history in the contemporary functioning of the data center, that despite its presentation as something that is so new and defies all of these past inequalities, and especially in terms of the internet, promotes this kind of utopic vision of connectivity, it largely reinforces the same inequalities and distances that have been in place for centuries.
Yeah.
Question regarding yours. I mean, it's the internet it's not new. It's a 1950s or project or something, but I have been thinking. I'm thinking if have you considered the new happenings and Facebook, Russian bots, everything that is being brought to light now, and how that might impact your research, and how to or if just how you might gather that into your research moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's difficult not to be an internet user today and not kind of constantly be presented with questions about new media and how it informs our relations to each other, how it informs our daily goings on. I guess for me, this project is emphatically focused on the data center and material infrastructures of the internet, because I find them so absent from those conversations. of course, I think those conversations are really important, and I would love to spend more time thinking about how these two sides of, well, not necessarily two sides, but rather how like the entire internet functions. But I haven't put in too much thought yet to linking those discussions to this discussion of infrastructure.
Just move down this row here. So I was really interested to see the way that you guys interwove all of your presentations, and I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the way in which the different scales that you're working at and the very different disciplines that you're working in kind of helped you each understand your own work and also kind of help develop that notion of hiddenness. And if there's things that particularly were moments where you thought, oh, okay, that's similarities I never would have thought of, how did that work out in terms of the way that you've been working together?
Yeah, I think the idea of hiddenness and its presence in all of our projects came up fairly early in the semester. We've been meeting with each other since February, and that was one of the first similarities we talked about between our projects. I think what's been striking to me in terms of finding similarities is that the similarities keep coming up, and things that Miriam and Dominique have said about their projects have shaped the way that I've seen my own research, and elements of hiddenness in the suburbs, like what they've said about their projects has brought me a lot of new ideas on that. So like even today in the middle of your presentation, the way you were talking about language and how we say the river is polluted rather than like we polluted the river. It's this interesting thing where we create these hidden spaces, and then when they fail, we blame them instead of talking about how those came to be. So like when the hypervisibility of suburbia fails, we talk about the families failing at it rather than it being a space that allows no privacy.
Yeah.
So those kinds of connections have been coming up a lot. It's been really rewarding.
As Julia mentioned, we got to the first time we met and we just introduced our projects really briefly. And as the meetings went by, we started like noticing the similarities, and it was kind of this open conversation where we were able to like link different parts and understand how things we were interested about in our projects were interesting from other perspectives. And I think we all kind of got to know our projects better by looking at what the other ones mentioned about our projects. And then the title, I think, was what linked it all together when we were like, oh, we are all talking about these faces that we are not sure of. And then, do you know where you are? So that was kind of how we got there.
Domi, you spoke about colonization a lot in language and also like coming from Brazil and everything. I was wondering, there's a part of you guys' presentation where you talk about what now and what to do and how to move forward. And if decolonization, because Brazil is very vast and it still has a lot of waterbeds and rivers, and so what are your thoughts regarding the protection of these waterbeds and rivers that are still open for protection?
I focused specifically in the center of Sao Paulo, which is already an urbanized area, exactly because I knew I couldn't talk and represent the entire country of Brazil, because of course there are areas that are protected and areas that are being, I would say, attacked right now. But I decided to work in an urban space kind of to reflect the backwards. So it's not a place you can avoid urbanization in because it's already urbanized. So can you re-urbanize it thinking about sustainable ways to go forward? So the damage is already made in a sense. But can we go forward instead of like following this line of thought of urbanization and rethink how we urbanize spaces and how are these spaces being used and how are we educating people about the spaces? So yeah, I'm actually really interested in how to bring indigenous voices to this issue, and I had an interview with one of the founders of Huas, Rivers and Roads, which is this movement that I've been researching a lot, and he mentioned that's a conversation he couldn't add to his educational tools yet, because first you he said first you have to educate people about what they can see and what they can't, to then bring the historical background. So that's the next step that a lot of these activists are working on.
Thank you.
I just wanted to first say that I thought all your presentations and projects were really interesting, and I thought even more so the intersection of three very seemingly different things was really interesting. But like you were just saying, all your presentations really got me thinking about how there might not necessarily be things to do about a lot of the hidden things that we see, but how sort of exposing those things and making hidden things visible might actually help us do better going forward. And I just wanted to say that, yeah, again, I thought it was really interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is for Miriam. Do you think that one way or another, the location of the data centers kind of like replicate the power dynamics of north-south, like the places where most of the data centers are located at?
They certainly are. Like, I mean, I think certainly like those kinds of lines tend to blur and are like difficult to draw. I guess on like a more site-specific level, they certainly, in my opinion, emphasize like dynamics between like rural and urban spaces. In that, another like funny phrase that really caught my eye when I was looking through the Google Data Center website was that they constantly are saying like they always like will have like a little like blurb about the data center and like, you know, why this location, and it's like, you know, available workforce, energy infrastructure, like, and like space is constantly coming up too. So I think certainly most of their data centers are located in the US and in other parts of the global north. They do have one in Chile, one, I think, but I mean, they are like mostly in very like industrialized spaces, but they certainly reinforce power dynamics between like urban centers and more industrial or even rural areas.
And even access, right? Like if most of the data centers are located close to the north, then who has more access to internet and to faster internet? I think that also can play into it.
This is for Dominique. I don't know if you've done research here in Manhattan, but have you heard of the Manasa Creek? Manasa Creek?
No.
You should definitely look it up. I mean, it's just interesting thinking about where we are right now, and literally like in, I don't know, 1 mile radius from here, there used to be this creek which flowed out into the Hudson, and just thinking about what it's done to change the landscape and just the urban area of Greenwich Village and West Soho. Just look it up. It's cool.
This is directed towards Miriam. Thinking about, so, you know, the whole presentation kind of struck me as a little Marxist, thinking about materiality. But how can we maybe thinking about like public discourse on what do we do? Maybe we could think about like, how do we talk about the technocrats, for example, Mark Zuckerberg, who's on trial right now, in, you know, sort of public imagination and like sort of potential sites of resistance?
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg freaks me out. I like just like a week, my Facebook was deactivated for like a year, and like a week ago I logged back on to officially delete my account, which by the way is like a really difficult thing to do. Like they make you go through like a number of sets of questions to confirm that you don't want to deactivate your account, you want to delete your account, and then they finally tell you that it may take up to 14 days for your account to be deleted. Yeah, and like this whole free basics thing where like Mark Zuckerberg is trying to like give the internet to the world, but then like the internet is produced as Facebook. Also, like on a side note, I'm from Hawaii. Mark Zuckerberg just bought like a 100-acre estate on Kauai and like sued people for just crossing it to access the beach. Not a fan, generally speaking. Yeah, technocrats in the public imaginary. I don't think I have necessarily an answer to your question about how we might like recontextualize them as like figures to resist, but I don't know, maybe sharing my own opinions about Mark Zuckerberg has kind of indicated a direction we might go.
Congratulations to you all on such a great presentation, really. I mean, it was so amazing to see the way these various sites weave together. And I'm thinking, Dominique, about something you just ended with, about the kind of productive potential of hiddenness. And I'm thinking about James C. Scott, who says something to the effect of, ideological resistance can best happen when hidden from direct surveillance. And I'm curious, as like a kind of departure or next step, how you guys can think of hiddenness as somehow productive, especially in light with Cambridge Analytica.
Can you repeat just the question?
Well, what you mentioned something about the kind of productive potential of something being hidden, right? And I'm curious if you guys had any discussions about that, or maybe as next steps, right, to look at the other side of something being hidden.
We talked a lot about what to do next and if something needs to be done to get these hidden spaces to be not hidden anymore. I think it's different in each of our projects. For example, Julia talked a lot about the horror movies and more of like a reflection of it. I focused a lot personally on activism and on talking with these different agents, and I'm actually, for my thesis for global studies, which I'll finish this year, I'm creating a magazine that's gonna kind of connect all these agents and like bring like a platform for community activism. So yeah, my answer in my personal project would be community organizing and bringing agents of design and architecture, urbanism, geography, people with different backgrounds of knowledge and ideas of how to create action to be organized together and create a community around that.
I do think also that the idea of hidden spaces as useful spaces and as spaces to be preserved is a really interesting one, and one that we didn't get to address, I think, in our topic, but one that I know for me has been coming up personally. So, like, even in the realm of horror film, like, hidden spaces are often where the monsters are, and the end goal of the movie is often to reveal those monsters and then to destroy them. And I love studying that, but then also on a personal level, I'm immensely fond of monsters. And often when watching the movies, I feel an affinity for them, and I'm like, oh, I don't want the monster to die. So I think, right, that's like very theoretical and in the realm of fiction, but I think there is something to be said for the value in hidden spaces, and also the kind of the room for difference that something being hidden can allow, kind of the space for different things to grow. When everything's visible all the time, I think there's much more of a pressure for it all to be similar or to be more normative.
Yeah, I think there is absolutely like a productivity to hiddenness. I mean, I ultimately, like, as an internet user, like, I call into existence the data center like every day, and I wouldn't necessarily want to give that up. I think our question of like, how is hiddenness made visible isn't necessarily a demand that hiddenness must be made visible and that like all hiddenness must be abolished, but rather a question to kind of just wonder about this hiddenness and like how it's functioning, like what kinds of other hiddennesses might we imagine, and what kind of productivities might those generate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to what end is it functioning?
We have to let the other get set up. Thank you for coming.